All right, we had a really good session, I think. It was, yeah, we talked a lot about data. There's a lot of different kinds of data. I mean, even now, like before Web3, there's a lot of different kinds of data: remote sensing, GIS, um, land use history. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. A big problem is it's not available. It takes a great deal of expertise to find relevant data. You have to go to a bunch of different sites, et cetera, and it depends on what state or what nation or where you live, all kinds of different stuff. And so that is an issue. A big, I guess, aspect of our conversation had to do with that data's relationship to the blockchain. Should we try to, I guess, blockchain the data? Can we? Some of us, I think, we're skeptical as to the necessity of that. And there are, of course, a number of oracles, I guess, now and coming up. Well, really, I think coming up that might provide a great deal of help here. And so we talked about some of those. Let's see here. Yeah, we want to incentivize the collection and the recordation of ecological data. We really didn't figure out exactly how to do that. It's also very important that we incentivize how that data. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be what was, what the actual sensor reading was relevant to whatever whatever we were looking at, and how do we incentivize that? And then for regen, like, can you allow, must all like verification of decisions or entry of data be signed on chain, or do you need to allow off-chain signatures or like other parties to validate that whatever's being submitted is accurate? Yes, sign that, or do they need to be on chain anyway? We talked about IPFS and Arweave as potential decentralized solutions to data availability in the future. And it was kind of emphasized throughout, because we were talking about traditional ag and stuff, that the dangers of centralization and the importance that we have resilient, decentralized, distributed systems that make ecological data available to the people that need to use it, which are the people on the ground. And that is a very big, I think, task, but it's not just up to regen, I would say. Yeah, we talked, one of the comments that I really liked was the idea of regional co-ops being created, and they could help. And so, like, we want the data from the ground to make it to Web3, so we can consult it with the oracles or do whatever we want to do. But that's really big ask, is that every producer know how to, get their data and format it and submit it and all that. It's not going to happen. And so we talked about the possibility of creating like a cooperative or cooperatives that let local people get together, and a way to basically pay them for their data without having to deal directly with each individual. And I like the idea of that co-op, because there's not really other participants in this particular market. It's not really a market yet, but with the future of Web3 as we see it, I guess that data is going to have value in the future. It has value to us. Yeah, I really appreciated the expertise of my group. Thank you all.
Any more comments from that group or questions for the group?
I think I would just add, like, reality check. You can't put data on chain that actually is useful for farmers today. And so if anyone actually is pretending that you can, don't. At best, you can get a hash to IPFS, which has some like off-chain record. And so I think we need to look really closely at where blockchain is a solution looking for a problem versus where it actually solves a problem. And so one of the biggest problems that we talked about it solving is who owns what asset class at what time, because ownership around those assets in the broader space of environmental claims is actually really important. And, the UN is addressing this at like the corresponding adjustments level. And similarly, corporations, like if I'm General Mills, but suddenly like Kellogg's in my supply chain is claiming for its soil health stuff, but I'm General Mills claiming on it too, actually, I'll get into a lot of credit. trouble. So if you can take all the data hashed to IPFS and then but actually attribute around geospatial boundaries to make sure that there's not double counting in that space, I see that as a real and actually useful use case that distributed ledger technology can solve.
More thoughts? All right. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, we're group 3, so I'll present that one for data. But to echo what Christophe was saying, our discussion initially started off on that kind of level of like, is data on chain, off chain, in a physical archive somewhere, in a Dropbox somewhere, a drive, like where it should be located, and the different mechanisms to actually reference that data. So in double counting did come up. So to echo that point, that's actually kind of where we started. But overall, we had a really nice discussion. I love just how smart everyone is and thoughtful. But we centered the discussion a lot about like on quality, price, and value, and kind of the relationship between the three, and that the underlying data actually supports the quality of a claim and therefore the price and the value in the marketplace. But we also were kind of trying to compare it to like time and cost to actually implement all these things we're talking about, and where the data comes from, how hard is it to gather the data, and we, trying to juggle like simplicity versus complexity, like how can we implement something faster, and then plan the roadmap further down the line. The other thing that kept coming up was like interoperability in money Legos, and basically how we like kind of plug in to the different layers, the different providers of the data, and how other people can share and use data. And also privacy concerns and community usage of the data, and like at what level, what data gets shared when, by whom, and like kind of that granularity of when it gets shared and why, and we talked about like data pull request or data buy request, basically, and whoever's providing the data can then control when that data comes back. But yeah, we did talk about IPFS. Obviously the data needs to be collected. The different storage services we talked about, should it be, certain data go on like AWS, or can some of it go on like FarmOS or OpenTeam, how GIS plugs in, etc. Just going through my notes here. Ocean protocol came up. Akash came up, which we can post links to, as to what decentralized data storage options are available. One that I've been tracking is dClimate, and another one, Digital Gaia. RSI, Digital Green came up as to kind of where these practices are being formed and put together. And then a lot of the discussion kind of veered towards like reputation. It goes back to quality of like incentivizing data, like incentivizing data collection, data publishing. Like, some people will want to just share data freely, right? Like just because they're here for the greater good, but there's still a quality mechanism to that. Just because someone's sharing it freely, like what, why, like how can we trust it? So what's the quality of the free data? But then also what's the, on the other end of like, how can we pay people or incentivize people to provide data that's hard to gather or hard to get? So we talked about like incentives and reputation, which kind of goes back to some of the discussion yesterday on funding and reputation score, which to me is all tied together in this. And let me know that I think that's I guess who will the data be used by? Like obviously the buyers, the suppliers, but it's like a sharing mechanism of like data is open and free, but who can actually make use of the data is important. So how do we make that data useful, and that goes back to quality. So.
Yeah, and I liked some discussion that was around how could we split between the data that might be public anyways, around the methodologies, the credits, issuance, and some aspects that will naturally become public, and some others that might, in some cases, be negative in some sense for the land stewards, like the geolocation, how granular, and if there's like a mid term between not sharing the geolocation or sharing some sort of area or something that is still useful for analysis and storytelling and for linking all the different stakeholders, but at the same time it's not counterproductive for the land stewards, or it kind of protects them in some environments where that information might be used against them or something. So also to think about that, in which it could be dangerous for farmers to share which information, and so how can we protect them, but at the same time allow research and all the things that are positive from data sharing.
Yeah, Giselle, I really love that aspect, and how do we protect the data of small credit producers? And we looked at it as being possibly asymmetric, where a large corporate entity such as Microsoft, the fact that they're purchasing credits is going to be public information. However, the data that's important, as you mentioned, like the geographic location, that could be encrypted and stored in the same location, but perhaps they want to share that information within their own personal network so they can coordinate with other small producers in the area. So they might be a permission-based system that allows actors to share with one another, but not share it with the public at large. So I really like that as well.
All right, let's move to verification. Does group one want to start?
Sounds good. So I'm Simon from Econavi, and after we gather our data, we have to get to verification. So we had a constructive discussion and debate on verification and the challenges linked to it. We hadn't reached an ultimate conclusion, but I guess it sort of underlines the challenges of existing verification, that like figuring out what is the ideal level of rigor. And so so starting, I guess, with the problem at hand, we basically established that, you know, what needs to be done for proper verification is, you know, have confidence in the verification, the resolution, so what's being resolved, over what time frame it's being done, who's the claimant, and finally the rights of nature, and then the role of the land stewards within the contract of what will be verified. Now, we went through this, what for us seems like quote unquote easiest to more difficult, let's say. So first we had the discussion on the language of the sort of semantic debate, language of verification versus validation. Sorry. And here, you know, we had different perspectives. One from that was put forth by Dorn, that he preferred the notion of validation because it's, let's say, more positive, inclusive, less authoritative, less bureaucratic in a sense. And we were also then thinking of different, you know, different ways to say it. So one, for example, affirmation, certifying, confirmation, endorsement was one that we liked because it has a sort of bottoms up quality to it, and so the decentralized element to it. So so there was that. Then the next thing we discussed was what should be the relationship between validators and region and R&D. I guess all in all, what came up was the notion of digital intermediaries, so that all those that are overseeing processes of verification, possibly of those who are collecting the data, are in a sense building a bridge between regen and those that are fulfilling objectives on the ground. So this is certainly would be the case, for example, of Econavi or ERA in Brazil, and based on what other people are saying from the United States, other regions of the world, it seems like this is what would make most sense. Digital intermediary overseeing the processes and being like ambassadors, the first step to verification. Then for the next questions, we sort of combined it. Who should organize, train, and certify verifiers? How strict or thorough should we be with verification? How do we deal with disputes? And then are there existing verification organizations or networks that we can collaborate with? It was a sort of overall discussion that moved between the four. And actually, I would like to leave the floor to Rebecca, who I think was very efficient in explaining these parts, and was in our conversation in group 1. So Rebecca?
Sure, yeah. Nice job, Simon.
Thank you very much. First time I do this.
So what we were really, we ended up zooming out a lot more and thinking about it in a really progressive way. So at R&D, we talk a lot about progressive decentralization, but thinking about how we're using existing frameworks and existing levels of organization that are comfortable for producers and known, and that lean on more bioregional knowledge, and then ultimately build that out into a lot more of like that DAO structure, allowing for all of the nuances and dimensions to take shape. So there would be different levels of verification, not just in terms of different levels of credit, but even depending on what the needs are on the ground. So when it comes to like the disputes over findings and different levels of rigor, we really like the idea of letting folks decide for themselves that know better. So leaving less of a stringent framework for that. So we were really zooming out and had a great conversation. So that's us.
All right, let's go to the last group. Breakout group 2.
Cool. That is me. So yeah, we started our discussion by kind of just talking about like, what is verification? What are we verifying? So I mean, like, obviously there's the verification that the practice is occurring, but then we also talked about like verifying like data and like uploading data, or verifying that the correct practices are being implemented. Like if you're making an intervention, like how do we assure that intervention is the correct intervention? And another thing we talked about, like needing verification, is with the emergence of like more technical solutions, doing things like code audits. Like how do you know that someone didn't like accidentally put a bug in their code and that made an erroneous calculation? And there's just like a lot of different elements for verification. But yeah, we really started our discussion by talking about like, what are the existing means of verification, and thinking about like traditional kind of like carbon market registry programs. Like you have verification is often focused on having someone actually like visit the site. And the verifier is like a certified verifier with like an ISO certification or something else that's going to be double checking by actually visiting the site. But one thing Joao really pointed out is that COVID introduced this whole new level of verification where they couldn't really be doing these in-field visits, and there's this migration towards kind of like desk audits, which are also emerging with remote sensing and kind of just like remote data collection. Like, do you really need to go visit the field, or is it enough to do kind of like a desk audit of given the data and how it was collected and how it was measured and processed, like can we replicate that work? Did that all kind of check out? And one thing that we were talking about with that too is like, COVID introduced a lot more interviews, and I think that there's a lot of value in, discussions with land stewards, with the people doing the work, collecting the data and stuff, and shedding light on like why certain decisions were made or why certain things occurred, right? For instance, you could collect soil samples and maybe you didn't measure like the gravel content in there, and that would be a huge red flag. But maybe the reason is because like gravel content measurements were like didn't make sense in that area for that soil type, or because that introduced a new cost that was inaccessible to land stewards. And so just like the importance of sharing kind of these conversations that historically we might not think as important in the verification process. And then we kind of talked about, sorry, I'm just going to plug my computer in. Yeah, and then we kind of talked about similar to what it sounds like the other group talked about, just like the terminology of like verifiers versus auditors versus oracles or truth tellers and kind of their roles, right? So, maybe a verifier is someone that is doing those in-field visits. Maybe they are recollecting data, or for more of these like social indicators, like organizations of, women's groups or financial distribution within a small community, like having a verifier go and just make sure that work or that program that might not just be like hard kind of in-field data is being collected correctly. And maybe auditors are more, and I liked your guys' groups kind of readjustment of that terminology, more doing like desk audits and like looking at the records of data and monitoring, and also introducing this idea of like an oracle or a truth teller that's like either a human or machine that's kind of just like providing that extra assurance. Let's see. Yeah, and then kind of getting into the different roles we were talking about, who should train, organize, and certify like verifiers. And with the emergence of new technologies, if land stewards want to do some of the verification themselves, like how can we enable them to do that so it reduces costs and it kind of makes the process more inclusive? Or, how can we create fellowship programs and, kind of like introduce more like citizen science kind of projects where people can help train different actors in the system to verify or use tools that kind of add to that assurance. And then we ended on kind of the relationships between verifiers and Regen Network and R&D and what our role is. And the Regen Registry is very focused on being very inclusive and kind of like Becca was mentioning, allow for the creation of these like DAOs or decentralized organizations where for a specific methodology, a program, an asset class, people could decide on the standards there and like decide, who plays what role. But, that this kind of also introduces this idea of legitimacy, which we talked about yesterday. Like if you're having, someone that has the skills to do a geospatial audit or an audit of like a remote sensing analysis, like how do you make sure that person like did it correctly, and introducing this idea of like reputation scores. So the more you're contributing to a project, the higher your reputation score could get. And this idea of like verifying the verifiers. So like maybe you, to build your reputation score, just like doing additional audits of work that's already been done, but it's just showing your willingness to like participate and engage with the system. And yeah, I think that was a bit out pretty much it. We got on a somewhat tangential discussion about like buffer pools and like uncertainty and the role that plays in verification, and also just like the challenges with verifying new types of ecosystem service credits, right? Like, so if you have a biodiversity credit where you're using like camera traps and jaguar tagging, like what is the role of verification there? Or like, should you even be verifying and doing like in-field visits? So yeah, any questions or comments from others in our group?
I want to quote Dorn for something he once said, that we shouldn't be in a system where monitoring, reporting, and verification is the basis for a functioning system, but the byproduct of. And what that really means is we move beyond ticking the box to the process of verification being key business information that people adopting these interventions need. So like specifically, I've seen programs where soil tests are just required because you got to submit it so the registry can issue your carbon credit. But that's ridiculous that the farmer doesn't have that information or doesn't have the information to like daily remote sensing availability, which is a huge data value to be delivered back to the farmer. So for what it's worth, I think verification is a bad term. Maybe there's a better term.
All right, thanks everybody for your comments. I think I have a knack for picking bad terms. So I really appreciate people speaking up about this. And overall, I mean, for me, this is fantastic because I feel somewhat in Vermont and, sort of on my own. And it's just great to have all these different perspectives and expertise coming in one room and talking about this stuff. So for me, this has just been outstanding. So thank you, everybody. And keep in touch through the Discord. I think that's probably going to be our primary channel for, at least for now, till we get something else up. But as we have news and deciding what we're going to be doing with all this and future gatherings, I think the initial place will be the Discord channel. So anybody, thanks. I don't know if anybody's got any other questions or something before we split. We got a couple of minutes.
We should do this again.
Yeah, I also just want to give a big shout out to Ned, and Ned's pretty humble about this, but he really did a great job organizing and writing kind of this like entire program and this entire retreat. And I think that this has really shown the value of like, what it means to work in public and connect people and have these sorts of discussions, because, you might think a certain way and then all of a sudden you bring in a bunch more people and your perspective is very quickly changed. So big shout out to Ned for that. And in terms of follow-ups, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we'll probably take a little bit to synthesize this information, but it would be great for those of you who aren't on the original email list, just send me an email so we could just, mark your participation, and we'll be continuing these, either more sessions like this or leveraging platforms like Hilo to continue discussions around certain components. But yeah, this feels like a really exciting start to a lot of different types of work.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Very, very good. Well done.
Nice to meet all of you.
Thanks, everyone.